Hey guys, this lecture series is going to be over the respiratory system, which we've been dealing with for about the past 2 weeks. Just some of the key activities that you kind of have to remember throughout the respiratory system is we put the manic on the mannequin. We put the respiratory system on there, and then we did that spirometer lab as well, in which we measured all those different things on our lung capacity graphs, as far as tidal volume, IRV, ERV, those different types of things will reappear on your test as well. As far as the prescription drugs activities that we've done, you don't have to know what each of those abbreviations stands for. I'll kind of give you a key for that, but kind of understanding like being able to read those codes and then interpret what they actually mean. If given a key, you're expected to be able to do that. So let's get started here. So the very first thing we need to know is the major organs that are associated with the respiratory system. And what we have is we have the nose, we have the pharynx, we have the larynx, we have the trachea, we have the bronchi, then we have the lungs, and then in the lungs, these bronchi, primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, eventually make your way down the alveoli. And then remember, the alveoli is where the gas exchange actually occurs. All these other structures that we talk about are called conducting passageways. And basically, in a conducting passageway, all you're doing with the air that's coming in is you're cleaning the air, you're moistening the air, and you're warming the air. It's not until you actually get to the alveoli is where the gas exchange occurs. You'll be asked several questions asking the area the gas exchange occurs. Remember, gas exchange only occurs in the alveoli. All these other structures prior to that are cleaning the air, moistening the air, and warming the air to get it ready for it to be exchanged. This is a similar diagram that's going to appear on your test. I would know the nasal cavity, I would know the nasal conchae, I would know the pharynx, the trachea, the primary bronchi, the secondary. I would know your lungs, know that one lung is bigger than the other lung as far as the right lung has more lobes associated with it than the left lung. Note this muscle down here is called the diaphragm. But I would study this image extensively because this is an image that's very similar to an image that's going to appear on your test. So the major function of the respiratory system is it's a gas exchange between the blood and the external environment. Is what you're going to do. So this is the gas exchange organ system of your body, is the respiratory system. Remember, we're going to load the blood with oxygen, and then we're going to dispose of water vapor, and we're also going to dispose of CO2 into the environmental air from the blood. So we're bringing in from the environment, we're bringing in this oxygen, and then we're disposing of some of the waste products, the waste gases that were produced as a result of cellular respiration in the form of CO2 and water vapor. On the way down, what we're doing is we're going to clean the air, which is the purification part of it, and we're going to humidify the air, make it moist. The reason we want to make it moist is because the exchange happens a lot more effectively is if the air is really humid. And then we want to warm the incoming air to help maintain homeostasis, is one of the things we have to do with this air that's coming into our body. So the only visible portion of our respiratory system is the nose that we see. Air is going to enter the nose through the nostrils. The nostrils are also called nares. The interior of the nose consists of a nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is divided by a septum. Sometimes you get hit in the nose, or sometimes, genetically speaking, you wind up with this type of septum that's here. This is called a deviated septum, where air doesn't come in real, it comes in and there's kind of a kink in the hose type of thing to where it doesn't make its way through the rest of your respiratory passageways because there's not a lot of air that's able to get through this area. A lot of times individuals that have a deviated septum, they have to get some type of surgery to correct this so they can breathe properly. What separates the oral cavity from the nasal cavity is your hard palate and your soft palate. You have a bone that's called the maxillary bone that's hanging out right here. This is an example of a cleft palate in which these bones didn't fuse correctly here. So now we don't have separation between the oral cavity and the nasal cavity. You don't see this that much in the United States because they correct this relatively right away. In third world countries, you'll see a lot of individuals that might have this type of cleft palate, in which they have to have a surgery then that's able to fuse these together. But like I said, in the United States, we tend to take care of this relatively quickly. So this air is going to come in through the nostrils, and then when it comes in through the nostrils itself, it's going to hit these side lateral walls that we have, these little folds in there that are called nasal conchae. What happens when the air comes in and hits this actual nasal conchae is it makes the air very turbid. And what I mean by turbid is it shakes up the air. So it shakes up the air, and any dirt and particles and things like that that are in the air are going to get caught in mucus. And when it gets caught in this mucus, you have these ciliated mucosa cells that are in your actual nose itself, and they contain cilia, and they take this debris that they catch and they kick it towards the back of your throat, where it's going to come down the pharynx, and then it's going to get digested. So you have these little tiny cells in here. They're going to be continuously with their cilia to kick out this dirt and debris that gets caught into this mucus towards the throat to the pharynx. Then it's going to go down the esophagus to get digested. And an interesting thing about these cells that are in your actual nasal cavity themselves, these ciliated mucosa cells, is under cold temperatures they stop working. And this is why you get a post-nasal drip. So what happens during a post-nasal drip is rather than have these cilia beat continuously towards the back of your throat, they don't beat at all. And because of that, you're going to have snot that's going to run directly, this mucus is going to run directly out of your nose, which is what happens in these cold type of temperatures. The major thing that's going to occur in the actual nasal cavity itself is we're going to moisten the air, we're going to trap incoming foreign particles, and we're also going to warm the air. I forgot to put warm the air here on this PowerPoint slide, but make sure you know it also is going to warm the air. Note that on the inside of your nose you have a lot of capillaries that run real close to the surface. They're going to warm this air to help keep our body at a stable temperature itself. This is also why you get a nosebleed relatively easily, because if you crack just a little bit of the inside of your nasal cavity itself, it will bleed because these capillaries are running relatively close to the surface. Don't forget the lateral walls of your nasal cavity have these projections that we call nasal conchae. These conchae are going to increase the surface area to allow the air to have greater contact with your nasal cavity itself. This increases the air turbulence within the nasal cavity so we can shake out any dirt and debris that may be in this air itself. And then we separate the nasal cavity from the oral cavity by the hard palate and then the soft palate. The soft palate is muscle, and the anterior hard palate is bone. Remember, if these bones don't fuse correctly, you wind up with what's called a cleft palate, which is what I showed you in a previous slide. What actually helps produce some of this mucus is these paranasal sinuses. So you have these sinuses that are up here. Let me go back to a previous slide here. You have these sinuses that are here. These sinuses produce this mucus right here. You have another frontal sinus that's right here. But these sinuses are going to produce mucus. This mucus is going to drain into the nasal cavity. And remember, mucus acts kind of like a fly paper, and it's going to trap this incoming debris and stuff like that. The main purpose of sinuses is to produce mucus, but they also are going to allow your voice to project and resonate is one of the things that it does, and it also lightens your skull. So these are all features of the actual paranasal sinuses, and these are located here. Sometimes you may get a sinus infection, and this mucus can't drain correctly because you have the inflammation response that occurs, and you have this buildup of this mucus. If it's like an allergy or something like that, you take an antihistamine to help reduce the inflammation response so then that this mucus can drain freely into your nasal cavity. So there's your paranasal sinuses that we talked about. Once we move to the back of the nasal cavity, we make our way into our throat. Our throat is commonly called our pharynx, and we move into the nasopharynx. Note in the back of the nasopharynx we have a little drainage from our ear, which is called the tube is called the pharyngotympanic tube. So the pharyngotympanic tube is going to drain into the nasopharynx. So as we move into our pharynx, remember from the digestive system, the three regions of our pharynx are the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx is the only part of the pharynx that only contains air. The oropharynx and the laryngopharynx are also going to house food as well. So they contain food and air in the oropharynx and laryngopharynx as well. And that's what this is saying right here. The oropharynx and laryngopharynx are common passageways for both food and air. So as this air makes its way down, the nasopharynx right here is that pharyngotympanic tube that I was just talking about. Right in here is where it's located at. We're then going to move down into the oropharynx, and then we're going to move into the laryngopharynx. That's right here. As we move right here, this air is going to make its way into this structure right here that's called your larynx. Another name for the larynx is called your voice box. So this is your voice box that's right here. Your voice box is made up of basically this rigid hyaline cartilage, and there's a flap at the very top of it that's called the epiglottis. So this epiglottis is hanging out right here is going to be kind of the guardian of the airways. And basically what happens is when you swallow, the epiglottis goes down and your larynx goes upward. So your voice box moves up and presses against this actual epiglottis itself to close it off, so that therefore you don't get food going down into your windpipe to prevent you from actual choking. Also in the larynx, you're going to see these little tiny cords that are in there, these cartilaginous cords that are in there that are called vocal cords. And this is what's creating your voice. As air travels across these vocal cords, they vibrate, and that's what's actually going to create the sound of your voice. Now, men in particular, their hyaline cartilage is lining the actual trachea itself. As it gets bathed with testosterone, it becomes a lot thicker of a cartilage that's going to develop on there, which is why men tend to develop what's called an Adam's apple. So men have this Adam's apple from this increased bathing of this testosterone that's having an effect on this hyaline cartilage, which also, because now I have a thicker voice box with this cartilage surrounding it, is one of the reasons that men have that very deep voice that they have, that's associated with them. Because of it, and females tend to have less of that deep voice, because they don't have as thick of cartilage that's lining their larynx itself. So here's the epiglottis that we talked about. The voice box, the larynx, is going to play a role in your speech production. When we take a look at the larynx, some of the structures that we have is like when we swallow, the epiglottis rises and forms a lid over the opening of the larynx itself. So your larynx kind of goes up and presses against that epiglottis. It's going to route food to the esophagus and air to the trachea. And the epiglottis is also going to protect it. Basically, is protecting the opening of the larynx to prevent food from getting down there so you don't choke. When you look at the vocal cords themselves, they're going to vibrate with expelled air. So as air is traveling through them, these vocal cords are going to vibrate. The space in between each of the vocal cords is called the glottis. So the space in between each of the vocal cords is called the glottis. And this is right here is your vocal cords that are right here that you can see. So now this air is coming down through here, come into the larynx, and now we're going to make our way into the trachea. When I take a look at the trachea, it's about 4 inches long. So this is the trachea that's right here. It's about 4 inches long. And basically, it's lined with similar cells that are inside your nasal cavity. It has these ciliated mucosa cells that are in them as well. And when they beat continuously, they're going to send back the actual dirt and debris, and they're going to kick it out the opposite way that the air is going. So air is coming down into your lungs, and then the ciliated mucosa are going to beat in the opposite direction to kick out any of this dirt and debris and send it down the actual esophagus itself. Now, sometimes if you smoke, these cells can become paralyzed and no longer work effectively, which is why you get smoker's cough when the person has that cough. That smoker's cough is because the ciliated mucosa cells stop working. Viruses can also attack these cells, which is why you get a standard cough when you do. And you don't have a way to clean out that air, so a lot of times these dying cell debris and stuff like that is what's going to get into your lungs, and the only way for that to be able to get out is for you to be able to cough. Remember, the cough reflex only works when you're conscious, so in order to cough, you have to be conscious for that to be able to work. We talked a little bit about people passing out and choking on their own vomit when they pass out, because they're inhaling that and they don't have that cough reflex because they're not conscious. Which is why a person that becomes extremely intoxicated under the influence of alcohol or things like that, you want to make sure that you put that person on their side, so that when they do throw up, that vomit that they produce goes outside, and they don't have a chance of inhaling that and basically drowning on their own vomit because their cough reflex is not working. This is that windpipe that we have. It's a 4-inch long tube. It's lined with the ciliated mucosa, and we're talking about these beating in the opposite direction of the incoming air itself. It's going to expel mucus loaded with dust and other debris from the lungs. So we're still cleaning and purifying this air as it's moving down the respiratory passageway. Again, this is just another conducting passageway that's doing that. These are what these ciliated mucosa cells look like. You can see these little hair-like structures on the surface of them. They're going to help filter out and clean that air itself. As we move down the trachea, it eventually branches off in what we call a primary bronchi. And this primary bronchi is going to go into the lungs in an area that we call the hilum, which is a medial depression inside the lungs themselves. Not inside the lungs, but on the outside. You have like a little tiny depression that's occurring in the lungs, and that's where the primary bronchi is going to enter the lungs themselves. These bronchi are going to break down into smaller and smaller components, and eventually wind up with what's called a terminal bronchiole, in which we find these little alveolar sacs at the end of them, and that's where the gas exchange is going to occur. So this is the primary bronchi right here, the right primary bronchi right here. and your left primary bronchi right here leading into the lungs, this little indentation that we call the hilum. When we take a look at the lungs, we notice that the lungs themselves are relatively large structures and they take up the majority of your thoracic cavity. The apex of the lungs, the very top portion of your lungs, is going to go all the way up to your clavicle. The base of your lungs rests on your diaphragm. So the base of your lungs is going to rest on your diaphragm. The apex of your lungs is going to go all the way up to the clavicle. And then your heart sits in the middle here of your actual lungs themselves. Note that the right lung tends to be a little bit bigger than the left lung due to the positioning of the heart. So how your heart is positioned tends to make the left lung a little bit smaller because it tends to hang out over here when we take a look at it. So your right lung has more lobes than the left lung. I think you ask you a question on that, like on a true-false type question, as to one lung having more lobes than the other lung due to the positioning of the heart. The actual the cavity that the heart sits in, it sits in the thoracic cavity. We call this specific cavity in between the lungs. We call this the mediastinum. We call this the mediastinum that's hanging out right here, and that's where your heart kind of hangs out. So these are your lungs. Like I said, the heart occupies the mediastinum. The apex goes all the way up towards the clavicle. The base rests on the diaphragm, and then each lung is divided into lobes by these grooves that we call fissures. The left lung has 2 lobes. The right lung has 3 lobes. Here you can see the right lung's bigger than the left lung. You can see the positioning of the heart in this diagram as well. So as we move down these bronchi, we go from a primary bronchi to a secondary bronchi to a tertiary bronchi, the bronchioles to the terminal bronchioles once we get to the very end. So these are all conducting passageways, and then we get to the very end of the terminal bronchioles that are here. Once we reach a terminal bronchiole, we get to the very end, and what we find out, guys, is we have these little tiny air-like sacs that are here that we call alveoli. And then these alveolar sacs is finally we've arrived at the time where actually gas exchange is going to occur. I ask you guys like 5 or 6 questions on the test dealing with where gas exchange occurs in a variety of ways. Make sure that you're well aware that the gas exchange actually occurs in the alveolar sacs themselves. And then everything else, we're just cleaning, warming, and purifying that air. Cleaning, warming, and humidifying that air. So this is the respiratory zone. So you have the respiratory bronchioles, which is that end bronchiole at the end of the terminal bronchiole, and it consists of alveolar ducts. And then we have these little tiny sacs that lead into the air sacs themselves, which are the actual alveoli. And the alveoli is the site of gas exchange. That's right here. And you can see these alveolar sacs that are right here. These little tiny pores that are in here. So air is going to basically come through this duct right here, and then it's going to go up into the alveolar sac where the gas is going to be exchanged. These alveolar sacs have a ton of capillaries that are running around them. So they have a nutritive-rich blood supply that's running around these things, so we can make sure that we get all the respiratory gases that we need out of our bloodstream, and all the respiratory gases that we need to go into our bloodstream can occur relatively effectively. So you can see this is what the site of gas exchange looks like. This is your alveoli. This can have your atmospheric air in it. And this is going to have the air that's associated, or the gases that are associated with the blood gases that are here. The main gas that diffuses across the membrane is going to be oxygen. The main gas is going to diffuse out of the bloodstream into the alveoli is going to be CO2, as well as water vapor. Water vapor gas is going to come out this way as well, and you're going to exhale as well. It's a byproduct of our cellular respiration. Oxygen is going to get picked up by hemoglobin molecules. Remember, the red blood cell is basically a giant sac of hemoglobin, and these hemoglobin molecules pick up the oxygen and they transport it around throughout the bloodstream. Interesting fact is that if carbon monoxide is present in the air, this hemoglobin molecule for some reason would rather pick up carbon monoxide and transport it around your body than pick up oxygen, which is how you wind up with carbon monoxide poisoning. Basically, this hemoglobin picks up the carbon monoxide, leaves the oxygen, and transport carbon monoxide throughout your body. Your body has no idea what to do with carbon monoxide, and because it can't produce sufficient quantities of ATP, the person basically falls into a deep slumber and dies. And that's what happens with carbon monoxide poisoning, which is why you have a carbon monoxide detector in your house. in order for gas exchange to occur. Okay, so what are the events that must occur in order for respiration to happen? The very first thing that has to happen is we have to be able to move air in and out of our lungs. So we have to be able to move air in and out of our lungs. And how we're able to move air in and out of our lungs is with the help of our diaphragm, which I'm going to show you right now. So here I basically have a simple kind of experiment that I'm going to show you with your lungs. These two balloons in this tube that are in your thoracic cavity here are representing your lungs. Down here is your diaphragm. So we can see in here, guys, when my diaphragm contracts and it goes in a downward-like fashion, my lungs are going to inflate. And the reason that they inflate is because I'm decreasing the amount of pressure that's inside this area, because I'm increasing the amount of area that's available in my thoracic cavity. So you can see that again, my lungs inflate there, just like that, all right, as my diaphragm moves in a downward-like fashion. When my diaphragm moves in an upward-like fashion, what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the amount of pressure because I'm going to decrease the amount of space, and then air is going to move out of my lungs. So when this diaphragm moves downward, it's going to basically decrease the amount of pressure, allowing air to come in. When this diaphragm moves in an upward-like fashion, it's going to increase the amount of pressure, which is going to cause the air to be expelled from the lungs. So the very first part of respiration, in order for it to occur, is we have to have this movement of air in and out of our lungs. And the major muscle that's responsible for that is the diaphragm. So we call that pulmonary ventilation, is what we call that, the movement of air in and out of the lungs. The next thing that I have to have is external respiration, which is the gas exchange between the blood and the alveoli. So oxygen is going to be loaded into the blood, and CO2 is going to be loaded out of the blood. So now I have to have this oxygen going in. When we take a look at, guys, all the oxygen that's going into the bloodstream, it's actually a small percentage of the atmospheric air. Less than 1% of the air that's in your lungs, as far as oxygen is concerned, less than 1% of the oxygen is actually diffusing across the membrane. So don't think that it's like some major amount of oxygen is getting diffused across this membrane. It's a small portion of the atmospheric air is getting diffused across that membrane itself. You're still exhaling oxygen as well. If you didn't exhale oxygen, then CPR would never work. And CPR works because not all this oxygen actually that's in your lungs actually gets diffused across the membrane that is here. Once this oxygen gets diffused across this membrane, so we have diffusion or this movement of these gases across the membranes, once it goes across here and gets picked up by this hemoglobin molecule, we then have to transport it. So we go from the external respiration, which is the gas exchange between the blood and the alveoli. Oxygen is loaded, carbon dioxide is then loaded. Then what we have to do is then we have to transport it. So now we're going to have to go through the gas transport, and we're going to have to move this blood that's loaded with oxygen throughout our body. What does the movement of the blood? That's going to be your cardiovascular system. So we're going to transport oxygen, we're going to transport carbon dioxide via the bloodstream to the various areas that it needs to go to. Once this oxygen winds up at the tissue level, and then these tissues are going to take in this oxygen. So these tissues are then going to take in this oxygen. This is called internal respiration. These tissues take in this oxygen, and then they're also going to, as a result of cellular respiration, they're going to expel their gases that they don't want. So they don't want the water vapor, they don't want the CO2, so they throw these two gases out and they take in the oxygen as a result of the process. And then the CO2 and water vapor is going to go through the reverse fashion, and it's going to make its way back to the alveoli, where it's going to get exchanged from the blood to the atmospheric air, and you're going to exhale it that particular way. So it's just kind of a brief outline, guys, for you of the respiratory system. Don't forget, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me in class, whether you need to see me in the morning or sometime after school. I would start looking over the review guide, getting familiar with that. All the activities that we've done, I would look over those as well. The one thing I didn't cover in this lecture series is the respiratory graph. So I would really look over the tidal volume, the IRV, ERV, minute volume, and all those different things that we calculated during that spirometry lab, the breathing into the spirometer, that lab that we did. I would re-look over that lab, look at those graphs again to make sure that you're familiar with the different calculations that we did in that.